All right. Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us on this year's panel, Gaza, Ukraine, and Nagorno Karabakh, the challenges of covering conflict today. As if one conflict wasn't enough, two weren't enough, we're dealing with three of the most daunting, vexing, and complex issues. We're going to see what binds them together, if anything, and how the press does and ought to cover them. Before I introduce our delightful, esteemed panelists, I would like to go through some basic housekeeping rules, as this is everyone's first Zoom webinar, of course. I urge you, if you haven't done so already, to turn off your cameras and your microphones, and urge you even more to use the chat and question and answer function on the Zoom app to ask us all the questions that you would have, as we will be leaving a substantial portion of today's conversation to you and the questions that you would like to ask. And I'm sure there are many. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce this incredible panel. I'm doing this as I see them on my screen. We have Marc Champion, Bloomberg opinion columnist; Astrig Agopian, freelance journalist, photographer, documentary filmmaker; Dan Perry, former AP Europe, Mideast, Africa chief and Foreign Press Association chairman in Jerusalem. This is former bureau chief for the AP, of course, and Professor Mark Turner of the Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. I'm Liel Leibowitz from Thunder 11 Communications in New York and editor-at-large at Tablet Magazine. It is an absolute pleasure to have this conversation, and I want to begin in a deeply, profoundly unfair fashion to ask each of our panelists to take about 4 or 5 minutes and give an introduction, as we are dealing with three conflicts, and as some people joining us may be familiar with some, but not all, to take 4 or 5 minutes and describe the conflict, which I understand is an invitation to a disaster, as sometimes even the mere choice of words is a value judgment. And so I encourage each panelist to do it in whatever way he or she sees fit, focus on the outlines of what we're looking at and what people watching us at home should know, focus a little bit on the coverage of the conflict and how it's been, set the stage in whatever way you see fit. And let's start with you, Astrid.
Yeah, so I will be talking about Nagorno Karabakh. For the sake of everyone, I will start with the first war and the end of the USSR and when that started. We could go back in time, but I'm just not going to do it because it would get even more complicated. But so basically, Armenia and Azerbaijan are two tiny countries in the Caucasus, and they were part of the USSR. And a little before the implosion of the USSR, the two countries started fighting over one region, which is called Nagorno Karabakh, and Artsakh in Armenian is also a name that comes a lot. But I will refer to it as Nagorno Karabakh during this discussion. And basically, it's a region that was always mostly inhabited by Armenians, but they were also Azerbaijanis living in the region. And it was part of the Azerbaijani Soviet Republic during the USSR. So when the implosion of the USSR happens and, all those former Soviet republics are about to, gain independence, many wars happened, and one of them was the Nagorno-Karabakh War. So basically, it was mostly populated by Armenians who wanted to either get independence or join the new Republic of Armenia. And there were the Azerbaijanis living in that region, and Baku, so Azerbaijan, which didn't want that and wanted to keep the region in the new Azerbaijan. So the first war started in the end of the 80s, and in the 90s, 30,000 people were killed in total, and basically the Armenians won. So they took over the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as several districts around it, which were part of Azerbaijan. And it became one of those de facto states. So a region that is not recognized by anyone in the international community as, an independent state. And for 30 years, it was this kind of status quo of this republic that exists, but doesn't really exist, and is populated by Armenians, and it's related to Armenia, and no Azerbaijanis are left in the region, no Armenians are left in Azerbaijan, no Azerbaijanis are left in Armenia. And there was a short war in 2016, which didn't make the headlines at all at the time. It was really short. It was 4 days. Only about 100 people died. I'm saying only because, at the time didn't get attention because of that. Until in 2020, there was a new war, and this time Azerbaijan took more than 80% of the territory, the districts, And people thought that it was the end of the war. We will talk about this more, but basically always in the framing, it's when does it end? It's like this never-ending war, and in the media, it's always hard to know when it's over. But after 2020, a lot of people thought it was over, but it wasn't. And during 3 years, the conflict continued in a kind of slower pace. And we just assisted actually in 2023 to the kind of textbook example of ethnic cleansing, because there was a really short war, really 24 hours. And this time, Azerbaijan took over all the territory, and all the Armenians who weren't killed during that war fled. So it's, more than 100,000 people who arrived in Armenia and are now refugees here. And basically, for the first time, there are no Armenians left at all in Nagorno Karabakh. So that was a really short way to explain for a complicated conflict. But basically now the angle that we can talk about now is about this ethnic cleansing that happened. And it has been a war that was very difficult to cover in the last 3 years, especially because there was basically no access for journalists, international journalists, after the 2020 war. And because it's also not easy to work from the Azerbaijani side, not easy to work from the Armenian side. So there are many, many challenges that we will discuss in more details later on how to cover a region that you cannot access and how to work in countries where journalists cannot freely work.
Thank you very much. That was a very eloquent summary of a very complicated conflict. And Marc Champion, over to Ukraine, a war that you have been covering and writing about for so long and so eloquently.
Yes, that is hard to follow. I think I'd like to say three things about this particular war. The first is just how to think about it, and I think the simplest way to think about what it is as a war of succession. So you had the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the dog that didn't bark really was the really dangerous prospect of a war between the two largest republics, between Russia and Ukraine. It didn't happen at the time. When the Soviet Union fell apart, I was actually covering the war in Yugoslavia, where you had the Yugoslav wars of succession. And the great fear was that, what happened in Yugoslavia between Serbia and Croatia, and then Serbia and Bosnia, that this would happen in the former Soviet Union, and in particular between Russia and Ukraine. So it didn't. But what we're seeing now is a sort of, a delayed version of what we had feared at the time. It really began in 2014. And you had 8 years of low-level conflict after that. You had 14,000 people who died in 2014 and 15 in the war, and then you had this low-level conflict that went along a ceasefire line for 8 years. And those 8 years proved to be incredibly important in the sense that the Ukrainians, who had been totally unprepared for any kind of war, became so. They also became the aggression from Russia, the annexation of Crimea that happened in 2014, that really also unified the country in a way that it hadn't been before. And so then you come to the invasion of 2022, when President Putin hadn't been able to get what he wanted, and he finally invaded. And I think so the second thing I would say about this war is it's a really big war. And so one of the challenges of covering it as a reporter, as opposed to a team reporter, is it's just really large. You've got front lines of more than 1,000 kilometers, and those are the front lines. But the war is actually, it's a two-phase war in one way. It's a ground war, it's an air war, and the air war continues across Ukraine, which is a country the size of France. So that's, one thing to just sort of bear in mind. It really is the largest war that we've seen since World War II, and that has its own, issues when you're covering. The other thing that I would say, the last thing that I would say, is so it could go on all day, but the last thing that I would say that really marks this out is, first of all, it's one-sided coverage. So you cannot, as a reporter, cross the lines and go, report the Russian side. If you're reporting on the Ukrainian side, you have to do that. If you're reporting on the Russian side, you do that. This is very different from what happened in the Yugoslav wars, where you could cross the lines every day and talk to the Serbs and the Croats on either side. The only sort of mitigating factor there, and it's the last thing I'll say, is that OSINT, open source intelligence, has really exploded. And that has, with all its pitfalls, allowed one to do a lot that wasn't really possible, covering, previous wars. And to, the data that we have just in terms of, confirmed destruction of vehicles, et cetera, what happened, where the front lines are exactly, a day, you find out, if not on the same day, within a couple of days, exactly where everybody is along this huge front line. So that also is a big, really a big change in the way wars are covered. It has, loads of pitfalls of its own, of course. Verification is a huge problem, but it's a real kind of game changer in coverage. I'd stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you for this comprehensive answer. There are a lot of questions that I have. We'll get to them in a moment, but before we do, the newest entry to this very grim club, the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. Dan Perry.
Yeah, thanks, Liel. Look, I normally say describing the Middle East conflict in 4 or 5 minutes is Pulitzer Prize-winning challenge level. But my two predecessors faced no less a challenge and succeeded nicely, so I'll give it a shot. Basically, it's been a century of conflict between Jews and Arabs in a Holy Land, or Israel or Palestine, by whatever name you want to call it, where the current population of 15 million is about equally divided between Arabs and Jews. Some want to resolve this by a partition. The distribution of the two populations still sort of enables such a map, barely, while others on both sides prefer a single state in which their group somehow dominates. And some prefer a single state where no one dominates, but I think there's like 2% that applies to. So Hamas is part of the global jihad movement that has a bigger problem than just Israel. They object to Western civilization, essentially. And it belongs in the latter camp. It's been trying for 30 years or so to interfere with attempts for a peaceful partition, mainly by means of suicide bombings and other terrorist attacks against Israelis. And in 2007, they managed to seize control of the coastal strip called Gaza, which had previously been run by a Palestinian autonomy government set up there and in West Bank in the 1990s. Since then, they've used Gaza as a base from which to attack Israel because their goal is constant war, essentially, mostly by rocket fire, and that caused a bunch of mini wars. And on October 7th, they invaded with several thousand armed men and killed about 1,200 people in a massacre in communities around the border that featured burning alive babies and families and mass rapes and dismembering of pregnant women, and in general, atrocities that can hardly be described. So this caused Israel to decide to stop tolerating the situation, and they invaded Gaza in a full-blown war, which is made ugly by the fact that Hamas uses the population there as human shields. The result there is, again, entire families of innocents buried in the rubble of destroyed buildings, where Israel considered that they were Hamas targets. So for the media, covering this raises a whole bunch of questions where there's some overlap between what was said about the previous two conflicts. There's a question of how to cover information coming out of a police state, by the way, which attaches to Russia and to Azerbaijan as well, about which I mean Gaza, because Hamas is running it as a theocratic police state. How to handle civilian casualties in terms of the reporting. Are they war crime or not? To what extent to effectively, in your coverage, seem to forgive or minimize the Hamas massacre because Palestinians are the weaker party, in some ways oppressed by Israel, mainly in West Bank. And critically, to what degree do you introduce context into news stories when every effort to do so involves not only a century's worth or more of information, But wading through the landmines of two or more vastly conflicting narratives. And all this is further complicated by the fact that Israel versus the Palestinians writ large, beyond Hamas, is an emotional and combustible issue all over the world with political repercussions in quite a few important countries. That also slots into the increasingly fraught debate between progressives and the rest, basically, in North America and Western Europe, where there are narratives of oppressor and oppressed and decolonization and such things. So this maze of complications meets a new generation of news consumers at a time when they're getting a lot of their information on TikTok in simplistic terms generally, which saddles the news media. I guess that's part of what we're here to discuss, with the enormity of the question of how to bring about an informed citizenry on complex issues, as we need to have in democratic countries.
You basically asked my next question for me, because Professor Turner, it now falls to you the unpleasant duty of answering precisely this question. Not only are these conflicts immensely complicated, every single one of our panelists, basically gave us some version of, well, where do we begin? We go back 10 years, 15 years, 150 years. But also we are struggling to cover these conflicts objectively, accurately, with context and truth, while we live in an age in which social media are dominant, while a lot of mis and disinformation is spread all around, while a lot of media consumers are getting their information from a whole host of non-traditional sources. How do you train the new generation of journalists in a immensely complicated media landscape like this?
Well, I think everybody's sort of made my point for me. The fact that this is a very complex topic, or very complex topics to kind of cover for everyone. This will be sort of rudimentary for some people, foundational for others, but to think about the very basic idea of what we do as journalists, and that is to report facts and truth as we know it. And that's what I tell students all the time now, is that we have some things that we have sort of put to the side and said this is sort of impossible, sort of our objectivity to approach something in a very non-biased way. But the very basic idea of covering these conflicts has to be from a point of unbiased coverage as much as we possibly can. And that's sort of the general idea of how I want them to approach most any story that they have. Certainly there is an opportunity for advocacy, but that is not, in my mind, journalism. That is not exactly what we want to do if we're going to call ourselves journalists. So, and I would approach this in a couple of ways. This is looking at how we sort of frame these topics. We sort of look at them, honestly, traditionally in journalism as sort of horse races, right? And as Astrid said, some ways chronologically. So we look at who's winning and who's losing. We look at when it starts, when it ends, without looking at some of the nuances. And that's as everybody points out, the hardest part for us to kind of get into. And then we got to think about also, as others have already pointed out, is how people receive this information, what they're going to do with it, and how they sort of can take it in and make the most of it. And I think that's the difficult part for our students sometimes, because they are wanting to sort of explore things in a way that maybe everybody's not going to relate to. And that's a really important part if you're going to be thinking about journalism. We can cover this all day and do all the things that we think are important to inform people and engage them in a way. But until they can receive it in a way that's easy and digestible and relates to them, then we're going to always have some problems. We're always going to have that difficulty. So I would ask you, as you're covering these wars, these conflicts, these awful things, is that how can you make them relate to a public that is short on attention and short on time, so they think, to kind of talk about these things, to kind of be engaged with them in some way.
So once again, you're doing me the great service of sort of asking my questions for me. This is the easiest panel I've ever had to moderate, because there are going to be a lot more questions about journalists, but I want to turn for a second precisely to this question, the question of the audience. Look, There are a lot of conflicts, sadly, going on in the world today. We're here representing three of the most complex, bloody ones. But it is not only possible to imagine that readers and viewers and listeners have some kind of conflict fatigue. It's also possible to imagine that, if I sit in my house in Akron or Seattle or Houston, and I, want to read about my favorite sports team, I want to read about my local politics, I don't really know why I should care about Artsakh or about Gaza or about Ukraine. So this is a question for the entire panel, and it's the empathy question. I get the fact, I get the objectivity. Do you believe we have an obligation to stir empathy as journalists? And if so, how? Marc Champion, maybe we'll turn to you first.
So interesting question. So I would say that I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, how am I going to encourage empathy in the readers. I think I, tend to more think, so how do I explain to readers that this should matter to them, and that obviously gets to the point of how do you choose which conflict. Obviously you don't necessarily choose it on your own. You, as a news organization, you do so. You decide what's important and so on. But it is critical, I think, to keep reminding people of why is this important. The war in Ukraine, it's a pretty easy sell in that sense, because you have on one side a major nuclear power, on the other whether it's economic in terms of transit routes for energy, whether it's human in terms of refugees flooding into Europe where your readers are, whether it's financial military in the sense that the US is involved, another major nuclear power, in arming the Ukrainians. So it's not very difficult to tell them why they should care about that. Other conflicts become much more difficult. There are conflicts that have gone on for many years with huge death tolls in places like Congo in Africa. Really much harder to explain to people. So why do we need to care about this one? And who are the people who are fighting each other? Why, etc. That's always complicated. But the further away, the less people can kind of relate to it in stories that they know, like they know all about the Soviet Union and what Russia was and its nuclear threat, etc. These are things that, as a journalist, as a storyteller, it's easy to kind of hook into. And get people to relate to what what's going on. In other places where people are much less familiar and they don't have this long narrative that they can talk to, and you may not be able to find it on a map. That's a lot harder.
Astrig, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, recently released a much talked about report in which he said that the situation in Artsakh was nothing less than genocide. And yet, when I talk to most of my friends, even the most educated among them, and mentioned the words Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh, they stared at me blankly and said, "We're very sorry. It sounds vaguely familiar. We don't know what that is." Same question to you. How do we get people to care about this conflict?
So I agree with what Marc was saying. Actually, you have to explain why it does matter. And for a conflict that is less known, also because it's two tiny countries, sometimes you have to take an angle that people would understand. So for example, Russia is also one of the actors involved in this conflict, right? And sometimes just by explaining that, and by not going back too much into history, but just by explaining, okay, those are actually two former Soviet Union countries, that's how you can get the attention of people who will be interested, who will be more curious. Then, what always matters in any case is international law and empathy in the way you're working also, because whether it's Nagorno Karabakh or Ukraine, as a journalist, when I'm working, I'm dealing with people who are probably living, one of the worst days of their life. So I always keep that in mind when I'm working. But then I think if you're a good storyteller and you just do your job, plus you're able to explain why it matters, then you're going to be able to hook the audience a bit more to get their attention. You can also try to explain the role of their country, because a lot of times they think it's far away and they have nothing to do with it. But it's not always true. And that can be one way of making them, understand. But then what's also very complicated with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is that even Armenia and Azerbaijan are usually two countries that people have not heard about. But, once you have those images and you have the good storytelling, there's always a way to make them interested in what is going on. But I would say that practically speaking, also as a journalist and also in the newsrooms, when I see how it works, some conflicts are also less covered because they're more difficult to access. Just pure simple reason. If a journalist cannot go somewhere, then it's harder, to report and to get the stories out of there. But when you're able to do it and to push it, there is some attention. And I think that for Nagorno-Karabakh, during the ethnic cleansing that just happened in September and October, for the first time almost, I want to say, we did get more attention, because when people got out, we were able as journalists to go and film and talk to them and get the story out. Whereas before there was a blockade for 10 months where no journalists were allowed. So it's really hard to get the attention of people when you cannot even produce any reports.
Dan Perry, you get the opposite question, because it seems that the particular conflict you're here to talk about gets, if anything, too much attention, with massive demonstrations in cities all over the world, with a lot of front page coverage, with a lot of media organizations, including my hometown publication, the New York Post, basically covering it's seemingly nothing but this conflict for weeks now. Explain this to us. Why is it so fascinating?
Well, this question has been addressed by PhD theses, and I've yet to find an answer that really can explain the incredible profundity of interest in the story of Israeli Arabs. And I think I have to conclude that it's a combination of the fact that in the end, this is an extension of one of the oldest stories in the world, which comes from biblical times, essentially. And in a Judeo-Christian world, and of course also in Islam, basically half the planet has its origin story somehow connected to what goes on in the Holy Land. On top of the Jewish people who had an absolutely profound impact on Western civilization in a whole variety of ways that I don't need to detail here. They're part of the story. So it's a little bit of a domestic news story in North America and parts of the US. On top of which, parts of Europe, on top of which, obviously, you have a nuclear power, as in the case of Russia with Israel, and you have a massive impact on the world economy, not because of oil only, which is the obvious one, but also because of Israel's impact currently on the global tech ecosystem, which is almost beyond belief for a country of almost 10 million. So there's a lot of reasons for it. Part of it also is there's a dynamic that sort of feeds upon itself. And this is an issue that is a challenge for people who want to bring attention to Nagorno Karabakh. That's been very unfairly, I think, undercovered, because it's a hugely interesting story, but people don't know about it already. Remember that the news media, by and large, not all of it, but most of it, is a business. And their actual goal is not to bring empathy to any particular cause, but to keep people interested. People are more likely to be interested in that which they already know. And that's a real challenge if you're covering a story that may be important, but has been hitherto undercovered.
Thank you for this. Professor Turner, I want to turn for a second away from the kind of lofty questions we've been discussing for the last half hour and talk about a kind of practical question. Marc Champion mentioned open source intelligence. Obviously, living in a digital age has brought us not just a plethora of new tools with which to do our jobs as journalists, but also the temptation of great speed. Oftentimes we get a lot of information. It seems to be raw, it seems to be real, and we of course want to be accurate and diligent in our reporting, but we also want to get the story out there, and sometimes we want to get it out first. Can you talk a little bit about this challenge? And again, particularly from the point of view of training young journalists, of learning to control these information collection tools, if you will, or communication tools, without them controlling us.
That's a really good question. The idea that one of the things that and I'm probably going to turn this question a little bit, is the idea that we get a lot of information, and often that information is from, sources that are in power, the authority, right? And so we tend to frame them using that sort of information that they've given us. So the vernaculars that they use, the verbiage that they use is something that's going to be directly given to us that we actually send out. And that's usually the easiest way for us to do. So some of this is the ease of reporting that is going to be sometimes in conflict with clarity, or with, quality even. So just generally, I think, when do we use the word genocide? When do we use the word ethnic cleansing? And that sort of is an opportunity that we can gather that information that from crowdsourcing from sources on social media and digitally, but that may not be the same verbiage that's being used by authorities. And so there is that sort of conflict that we have to kind of walk that line through. And so I think that's really important for us to sort of, as journalists, to see where we're getting our information from, to how we're going to disseminate it. But to your point, authority, sourcing is always going to be sort of the sticking point here. Is that how much of that information do we want to disseminate freely? Like there's a theory called frame sending, that we're just basically giving all that information that has been given to us and putting it out there. We're basically transcribing what somebody has already told us. And that is one of the things that at least social media, digital media, if we're using credible sources as much as we can, allows us to do, is to sort of push against just the authority, just what we're given as far as information goes.
You raised one of my own favorite kind of sticking points when it comes to covering conflicts, which is the words that we use. And it seems to me that very frequently when we cover conflicts, the story becomes a meta story. It becomes a story about the story, because then you see actual news reporting about the BBC refuses to refer to Hamas as terrorists, or Ocampo said that Artsakh is genocide. Is it correct or not? We get very hung up on these words. Marc Champion, is this silly? Is this just like a linguistic parlor trick that we do, or this is an unbelievable question to ask a journalist? But the words actually have meanings anymore.
Well, it's not silly in the least. It's highly political. So the word genocide in particular, it's when people use that, it's a way of saying the worst possible thing is being done by X to Y. And, personally, I don't think there is a kind of AP style. I'm not sure if the AP style book says what you should do on this, but, personally, I don't use the word genocide outside of somebody's quote, unless it's either, in a court proceeding or has been ruled. For example, if you're going to talk about whether it's a genocide that happened in Nagorno Karabakh, that's something that I wouldn't say, and I just wouldn't address it unless it's in somebody's quote and they're addressing it. Because genocide is a legal term, and to the extent it's useful, that's how it's useful, and that also allows us to limit it to to places where it has real meaning. Things like ethnic cleansing are much looser, they weren't created to be a law, to be a crime. It's much easier to talk about those things, about war crimes and so on, because those are sort of, defined more loosely, and they can apply to more things, and you can, discuss whether something is or isn't a war crime. But no, these things are immensely important because they are political. So people choose those words for reasons. And I think as journalists, we have to be really, really careful about, how we use those words, because as soon as you do, you are engaging in that, highly political debate.
Dan Perry, I take it that this is a big topic of conversation at the AP. this need for not just language, but the guarantee to the furthest extent possible of objectivity. Is it not? How do these conversations go inside
very, very much so. I mean, with all the terms that you mentioned, in particular, terrorism is a highly loaded word, because just as genocide is the worst thing a country can do, a terrorist is kind of like the worst thing a person can be. And even if a clear act of terrorism was committed, if you label the person a terrorist, from the point of view of media that is conservative about taking sides, that suggests that it's like a four-letter word. It's an insult, and they choose to be generally just much more specific, like a suicide bomber, and that's good enough for them. Whatever he did, shooter, attacker, in the same way that they speak of killers and not murderers. This doesn't please the partisans, but it's I suppose a good way to project that you're staying away from anything resembling advocacy. Now, I have to say, this also tends to put a lot of the media in a position of conflict with much of their audience, because people tend to take sides, and we risk sometimes in the media being a little bit dishonest. You interview Hitler, but you're not taking a side. You interview Mother Teresa, but you're not taking a side. We want to be always objective, but there is subjectivity in the choice of the topic. Like, do you report on this conflict, but not on what's happening in Southern Sudan? There's subjectivity in what you choose to cram into the 1,000 words you have in a best case scenario for most news articles, and so on. It really is very, very difficult. At the end of the day, I find that history resolves this problem, because something closer to a consensus emerges about things post factum that is difficult perhaps to foresee at the time that we're writing the rough draft of history. I mean, look what happened in Dresden, okay? Maybe 100,000 people were killed. Now, they were not Nazi officers. I don't think that was reported at the time as a war crime, nor with the type of implied criticism that Israel's taking these days for its operation in Gaza. There is subjectivity in the very fact of that. So essentially, I am always reminded of Carl Bernstein's famous quote that journalism amounts at the end of the day, when all is said and done, and we've concluded our semantic discussions and our theoretical discourse, to nothing more than an effort to achieve the best obtainable version of the truth.
So, Astrig, I want to launch off what Dan is saying and ask you a provocative question. Why do that? Why strive at all to the best obtainable version of the truth? Because sometimes, we see things as reporters, and we are human beings, that just profoundly impact us. I have seen the video documentation, the GoPro cameras of Hamas's atrocious attacks. I have seen from the outskirts of Artsakh, the starvation forced by Azerbaijan, and it was very difficult to remain sort of dispassionate. Why not write a profound call to action based on your, empathic, moral feelings? Why is objectivity even the baseline that we purport to aspire to?
Well, I guess as a journalist, you have to do your best to try to be. I don't believe in objectivity, as itself. Like, I don't think that really exists in journalism. But you have to be honest about what you're seeing and what you're reporting. And I just think we have to stick to international law. And even if, of course we feel emotions, I think that's normal. I think that's actually good. And if one day as a reporter, I don't feel any emotion reporting during war, I think maybe it's time to stop, because then you're also, it becomes dangerous the way you behave with your sources or people you might interview. But just for people to trust us and, to keep on reading the media, we have to try to. And I think we can also just be honest and say it if sometimes we have seen something that is deeply troubling for us. And you have seen a lot of reports, TV reports or anything where, you can say that those images are harrowing or what you're seeing is terrible, using terms like that. But then if you don't stick to the terms of international law and you start yourself calling this a genocide or this or that, then how are people supposed to, keep on trusting you and your reporting? That's why for me it's really the hard line. But then I do believe that the fact that other people are using those words and what you're seeing, you can combine all that when you're giving context to also explain why. For example, the word genocide, you were talking about it. A lot of Armenians are using it, a lot of people in general, and then also some international institutions even started using it, ethnic cleansing and genocide. But just, giving some context can help to explain why, because you're seeing this event that is horrible and all those deaths. And also there's history, and there's the fact that Armenians did experience a genocide in the 20th century. So there's this collective trauma, and that explains it. So just always giving context makes it okay to use the terms if you're explaining them and if you're not yourself qualifying what you're seeing. And even in Ukraine, I've also worked in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. And even there, the word genocide, sometimes it comes. And also there's the trauma of Holodomor there, and also death by starvation during the Soviet times, right? So if you just describe honestly what you're saying, and yes, it can be horrible and it can have an impact on you, and then you give as much context as you can, but you're sticking to international law in your reporting, then I think that's just the best way to do your job in the best possible way and to keep the trust of people who are reading you or watching your reports as much as possible. There will always be people who won't believe you or will have, preconceptions. But, having that hard line is the only way to make people trust your reporting.
That's wonderful.
Let me just quickly point out one thing, which is there is a difference between the degree to which objectivity and lack of bias is lionized in the Anglo-American school, at least a serious journalism of the Anglo-American school, and what you see on the continent of Europe, in France and Italy and Spain and so forth, where there's much more openness. Indeed, as their business is much more of a desire on the part of the audience to have something closer to personal journalism, advocacy journalism. And of course, in other parts of the world, the Arab world in particular, it's even more in that direction. So there's more than one school of thought about what journalism actually is.
Very fair. We're getting a bunch of really good questions. So I want to ask two more questions to the panel and then convey some of the great questions that we're getting. If you have any more questions, those of you listening to us right now, please submit them now. My first question is precisely about this. Without naming names, without pointing fingers, I want you to sort of give grades or give a general assessment briefly of how do you think the press, and I mean particularly the American and the European press, is doing in covering these conflicts that we're talking about. Professor Turner, I'll start with you, although I do want to hear all of you, so this is a rapid fire round, please.
I think to Dan's point, it's sort of hard to sort of talk about traditional press, and compare it to some of the other outlets in the world, right? So the idea that in America, we do have sort of this idea of objectivity, and I agree with Astrid that it's probably not truly possible to be completely objective and unbiased, because we all, just by the nature of what we do and what we choose to talk about, is going to be a little bit subjective, or more than a little bit subjective. But yeah, if your outlet, as in Europe and other places, is sort of has an agenda and has a bias that's naturally innate within that publication, then you're going to have a different viewpoint, right? So, but as I noted earlier, American traditional journalism tends to sort of condense topics in a way that is sort of a bite-sized, digestible chunk of whatever the topic or thing that is going on. And so in that way, we're great, right? We're doing good in the sense of being able to make people at least aware of something that is happening that they may not know of. So that's a B, right? But if we're talking about how engaging we can be and how influential we can be in informing them in a way that would make them have an opinion, we fail almost all the time, and not just in the topic of modern conflict and war. That is just something that we struggle with all the time. So I think we're average for what we're trying to do as far as awareness and information. Nuance, certainly we're failing. As we pointed out earlier, We're just not getting to the true context of these conflicts and these wars as much as we should be.
Thank you. Rapid fire. Astrig, over to you. Same question. How are we doing?
So I agree with Marc. I think we're lacking the nuance and the context. I mean, I work mostly for French-speaking media and also sometimes UK and American media because I'm French. And all of them have covered and are covering those three wars. They cover Ukraine way more, and I think in a better way, with some more context also because there's more budget and more reporters. So it makes all that possible. But I think there will always be a problem as long as they only send people and journalists when there's a crisis. So journalists go in 2020 when there's a war in Nagorno Karabakh, and then they disappear for 3 years. And they only come back when there's effectively ethnic cleansing happening. So we missed all the context and the nuances of what was happening during those 3 years that explain why ethnic cleansing just happened. And I think that's the problem. There's not continuous coverage of all those conflicts and regions. And I think by going there only during the big conflict and crisis moment, you're going to lack the nuance and the context of everything that happened before and led to that moment.
Wonderful. Marc Champion. Give us a grade.
So, yeah, it's a very good question. And of course, I'm, involved. So I have a, not necessarily very objective opinion of whether we're doing well or we're not. I think that in general, I think there's been a remarkable amount of very high quality journalism done out of Ukraine. People taking high risk in order to figure out, exactly what's happening at a given moment, and to try and get that across, spending a lot of time, a lot of, huge teams of people, huge amount of money in order to do so. I think there are very significant limitations, and that we really struggle to get over those. So, like I was saying at the beginning, this is a war you can cover from one side. I just before the war, I went to Mariupol, for example, because I knew that that's where the war would really start, having been there many times before in 2014, 15, etc. And I wanted to see what was going on. And I would love to go back there now. I can't. Right. I mean, I would so like to go and see what's actually happening in Mariupol, to see, talk to the people who remained and see what they think. It's a very complicated town. It always was. I'd love to go do that stuff, but I cannot, because I can't go to Russia to do it. I won't be allowed to, even if I go to Russia, I won't be allowed to go to Mariupol and do my job. So there are, severe limitations, but, within those limitations, I think in general, a lot of good work has been done, basically.
Excellent. Dan Perry, rapid fire, give us a grade.
Look, C. Basically, whenever you judge success or failure, you have to take into account the goal. If the goal of the media is to provide sophisticated, nuanced, and forward-looking, useful coverage of these conflicts, then clearly the grade may be an F. We have a complex situation here. Text is under-resourced, basically, because the media's business model, by and large, is falling apart. Those text reporters and others, photojournalists and videographers on the ground, are doing great work, no doubt about it, in all three conflicts. But the larger organization, basically, I think, doesn't think their audience wants much of this nuanced coverage that would constitute great coverage. And certainly with broadcast, it tends to be very superficial. And the biggest failure maybe is the mainstream media, that is going to be the only source, realistically, most of the source, other than a few bloggers, of sophisticated, nuanced, and great coverage, has completely failed in taking the story to social media, which is where the youth are today.
My last question before I turn to some of the excellent questions from our viewers is open-ended. I'm not going to point fingers or ask anyone. I'm putting it out there, and anyone is free to answer it. We're talking here about three conflicts, about Gaza, Ukraine, about Artsakh. Yet I think it is not unreasonable to ask, as we begin studying these conflicts, some of us may have the feeling that we're really talking about three fronts of what is in actuality the same war. We're seeing Iranian drones in Ukraine. We're seeing the same equipment more or less in Gaza. We're seeing Russian involvement in Artsakh. We're seeing fronts and alliances begin to be made. Is that, in your opinion, a fair assessment? Are we just looking at the simmering beginnings of some very large global conflict here?
I'm happy to have a go at that. In a very short word, no, I don't think so. I do think that there are, Putin, for example, is, a great opportunist, and I don't have any doubt that he's, since the war began in Israel, is looking for every way that he can possibly gain from it. The Iranians likewise, they do, there is this sort of broad background in which Iran, Russia, China, their number one concern is to minimize and reduce the power and scope of the United States. So that's true. And it creates a sort of broad background. But the reasons these wars have happened, none of them are a grand plot. The war in Ukraine happened. There's 1,000 years of history there between Ukraine and Russia, including the Holodomor. There's genocide. There's multiple wars. As I said at the beginning, this is a story of the succession wars of the former Soviet Union. The debate that tends to happen about whether NATO expansion caused it and so on is massively, unbelievably self-centered and simplistic. So these places have agency. Hamas has agency. Israel has agency. Israel made mistakes, and Hamas took advantage of those mistakes. Within Nagorno Karabakh, that's a long history. Armenians were in charge for, as Astrig said, they won at the beginning. They were in charge a long time. This didn't play out because of what was happening in Beijing or Moscow or Washington. Primarily those are all players, and that all goes on in the background, and they get their fingers in the pie. But these places, these people have agency, for better and worse. So that's how I would respond.
Thank you. So we have just about 8 minutes left. We have a couple of really great questions I want to make sure we get to. So the first, I suppose, is kind of open-ended, but maybe Professor Turner, maybe more to you than anyone else. Given all the things that we've heard here on the panel today, all the complexities and difficulties, if a young student were to come to you and say, Professor, I'm really thinking about a career as a sort of like war correspondent, the conflict coverage journalist, would you recommend it?
Yes. If they're passionate about it, then absolutely. If they feel like they can be a great storyteller, then absolutely. If the question is sort of inferring that there is danger, that there is more challenge than covering other things, then yeah, absolutely there is. But I think that is sort of anybody who thinks that that's something that they want to do and has the passion for it. Then I think it's absolutely a goal worth pursuing. I don't think I would send them unprepared. We teach here a couple of courses on foreign correspondence. We teach journalism and trauma. There's some things that we need to do to prepare them, certainly. But beyond that, yeah, I would absolutely recommend it. I didn't have the fortune to do it myself, but yeah, I think it's absolutely you can ask everybody else on the panel if they felt like it's been rewarding for them to be a part of telling these stories. But absolutely, it's so necessary and so important, and especially these days, these kids really have a passion. While I try to weed out the idea that advocacy is something else, but they definitely want to tell stories. They definitely want to tell stories of people, and often they may be something that they maybe a little bit misguided about some of the players and their agendas, but certainly they care about what's happening in the world.
Astrid, if a young reporter came to you and said, I'm following in your footsteps, I'm going to, get in the game, I'm going to cover conflict, what are some, one or two pieces of advice you would give her?
Well, I'm a young reporter myself, and I just started 3 years ago and already covered 3 wars, which I didn't really expect. So I would say go for it, because I cannot say not to do it when I'm doing it. I think just the most important thing is, unfortunately, the media industry is not really good, and most of us are freelancers. So try to find a way and find financement, to be able to do a HIFAT training, to be trained before you go to an actual war zone, to know how to react, to find PPE, protective equipment, to, think about all those things beforehand, because it is a war zone. And if you want to be able to do your job and to stay alive, you have to be prepared. So that would be the biggest advice, is to really not take it lightly and prepare for it, and secure as many contacts and assignments as you can before you go there. Because we're not tourists, we're journalists. So if you go, you have to just do your work and then get out, which is hard, because I know that it's also getting more competitive and there is less and less money in the industry. So it's really hard as a young reporter who starts out. But I still think they should go for it, because there are so many important stories to be told.
Thank you. Dan Perry, as we're struggling as journalists to get people to really care about these conflicts, how do we create, so-called entry points for audiences that aren't necessarily tuning in, that don't necessarily have the context or the background? How do we kind of like introduce people to these very complicated stories?
Look, you talk about integrated marketing campaigns. I think we need integrated journalistic campaigns. So many people are on social media now. I think that's probably your main entry point to a story that hasn't been familiar in the past. I think, practically speaking, people tend to respond better to emotional stimuli than intellectual. But what has actually happened, somewhat to our surprise, in the news industry in the past 20 years, is that the emotional side of conflicts kind of cancels out, because the horror of what's happening in Central Africa is just as great, if not greater, than what's happening in Gaza or Ukraine or Nagorno Karabakh. It has to do with getting people to understand that something needs to matter to them for practical reasons. I really hate that, because I wish it were more noble. But I think that if you want to have success, you have to find the entry points that matter to them. Now, that will differ for different audiences, and part of our challenge, and this is made easier by artificial intelligence and by all the data that we have at our disposal these days in real time, and our ability to analyze it intelligently, is to tailor it to individual audiences. An entry point for me might be different to that of others on the panel, and personalizing it as much as possible, or at least slicing and dicing by demographic, is an important way to go about it, I fear. At the end of the day, though, it comes down to what almost everyone here has said in different ways: great storytelling. You have to have a great storyteller. You have to be a humanist. You have to care about people. You have to care about society, really. You asked me, if you asked Astrid, I think, what to tell, and Marc, what to tell young people who want to join. I would tell them, you have to be a lover of humanity. If you really are, if you know how to deal with people, if you want a better future for our world, then there can be few greater vocations than, I think, journalism.
Marc Champion, we give you the last word with a particularly thorny question, which is, which conflicts that we have not discussed today do you anticipate making headlines tomorrow?
So that they are already conflicts now, or that they are to be?
I respect and shudder at the premise of your answer, but take it in whatever direction that you wish.
Well, I mean, so we are all terrible forecasters of wars. They tend to happen where we don't expect them, and not to happen where we do. But obviously the one that everybody is most frightened of, because there you really do have major geopolitical implications, is if anything should happen in Taiwan. We will be writing about that conflict as a conflict for years, even if it never happens, because if it did, it would be so, the implications would be so appalling. I would say that's the one we're going to be concerned about. In terms of conflicts that are already happening and they're not getting covered, I'm afraid that already answers itself. They're unlikely to get covered a lot more. Something would have to change that's fairly dramatic that makes them, we are as readers, as writers, in some sense very parochial. We only like to read about stuff that affects us. And I often, to younger reporters in smaller countries and so on, and they'll ask me, so how do you get a story that will get a lot of readership, out of a place like this? And I'll just say, well, you need to make people, think that it's about them and not that place. And in a kind of very crude way, the awful way that, the British media is terrible with this. That's why they're in the middle of some giant conflict and they find the one British tourist who's wearing a Band-Aid and they write about that, which is like the worst of our trade. But short of that, I think it's completely legitimate to say, if there's some, I remember doing a story in Poland, for example, where I was trying to write about the judicial reforms there, where the government was destroying the independence of the courts, the constitutional court. And how do you make that work so that people basically I just try to make people understand that this is something that can come to the United States. This was, before, as Trump was coming to office, more or less, but before things had really happened. So then, you can get people to think about things in other places because it allows them to think about, themselves and how it might affect them. So I don't know. I've gone in a long circle there. I'm not sure where I ended up, but
I think you took us precisely to where we need to be. And for it, Marc Champion, Astrig Agopian, Professor Mark Turner, Dan Perry, thank you so much for your wonderful, enlightening comments. And may all these conflicts be resolved soonest. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.